Hi, fellow geochemists and geochemistry enthusiasts. Welcome to Geochemist Tea, the only podcast for people who love geochemistry with a side of tea. This is a short episode that we're releasing ahead of our episode with Mike Whitbread on September 7th. This short is a teaser of where Mike believes geochemistry and our industry need to go.
I was looking back in our email chain when we're kind of working out the topic that we wanted to discuss on the show. And you brought up, namely just this crossover between classical approaches to interpreting geochemical data and where you believe our industry needs to go.
Where does the industry need to go? Well, we've got to start using all the variables that we're actually collecting, right? So if you look at a standard analytical suite, and if you're collecting spectral data on the back of that, you might have 250 channels of information that you've got sitting against every sample. And a lot of geos, particularly those that have come out of university, and the university sector in Australia is pretty dire. So there's not a lot of training in data analysis, and people are still looking at copper and maybe gold. And if they've read a Dick Sillitoe paper, they might chuck in a few other elements. And if Scott Halley's got to them, which is a good thing, Scott's done a hell of a lot to sell geochemistry into the industry in terms of actually utilising your data. But even, if they're following his workflows, they're still only, maybe touching 10, 15, maybe 20 variables out of their data set, and variables being, spectral data and elements. And it's clear that we've got to make more use of that information. And when one of the reasons that I put in the Jeff Stedman paper was around mineral chemistry, right, as an example of one of the new data types that's coming out. Core scanning, of course, is another one, and I think that's the June Hill's paper talks a little bit to that as well. And you've got different data types that have just are voluminous, right? You've got really dense information, and often down to a pixel if you're scanning. And what are we doing with that? Often we're aggregating it back up to a certain scale that we can manage. We try and marry it up with our assaying, and then people do that. In the end, they still only look at a couple of variables out of the file. So I guess that's been my mission for a long time. And it went back in the gas days. Gas was really a game changer for allowing people to visualize with their data, explore their data graphically. And that's how a lot of geologists sort of seem to work, right, with spatial creatures. And it sort of allows you to interact with your data and then send it out to your GIS or whatever. But and that's got us a certain distance along this path, but we're still using gas now, and it's been, another 20 years since I think IO Global took it from Cargini, and we need to be better than that. And we still we still occasionally catch up with the gas guys and try and influence the roadmap, because we want it to incorporate more machine learning aspects or different methods of summarising your data, distilling down that information and finding out what's important in it. But it's a work in progress. We're not there yet. And we're such a small market for software providers in the mining industry. We like to think we're important, but we're not very important at all. There's no one else, right? And so thank God we've got gas, because if we didn't have it, what would we be using? And the other side to this is that with time, companies have probably reduced the number of people relative to the number of rigs they're running or the information they're collecting. So not only do you have more data, but you've actually got fewer people to deal with it. And something has to give. Either the industry stops bothering collecting the information in the first place, which I don't think is where it's going to go, or we find smarter ways of dealing with it. And so at a high level, I guess that's where I think the industry needs to go. Does that paint a picture, or do you need me to sort of delve into certain aspects of that a bit more?
No, I think that's exactly what I was looking for in the sense that, our industry collects a lot of data and there's not enough people to interpret it. And also we're not interpreting it in a smart enough way across the large scale. There are people doing great work, but that's not, it should be more. It's kind of, in a way, you look at our cousins in oil and gas, and then you look at what we do, and it's embarrassing because we have great data. We should be doing great things, and yet we're just eons behind them. And it's just because at this point, our drill holes don't cost $10 million a hole, but that could be our future. So why not figure it out now?
Touch on an interesting point there. Sorry, I think you might have
Go ahead. No.
briefly, but that the value of a drill hole in the oil and gas industry is obviously higher, and so they make a lot more of the information they collect, but their problem's a bit more constrained as well. Whereas in the metals industry, we've got so many different ore systems that we're potentially chasing, and often we find things we don't expect. Right, we drill a hole looking for a porphyry and find something else. It's usually the way things go. But it is true to say that with time, because of land access and other issues, the cost of getting to the point of drilling a hole is much higher now, and the cost of the assay, which is usually one of the last input costs into that, is actually minimal compared to the cost of getting to that point. And so we tend to find that there's less resistance now to collecting assay data on every sample. And people will go, well, why would you assay the cover? We're looking for mineralisation in the basement. Let's just not assay the cover. And I'm going, well, if you find something, what do you think you're going to do with all that cover? You're going to put it on a dump. You're going to need to know what the chemistry of it is. The enviros will thank you for it. And if nothing else, what if you've got dispersion coming from a paleo high sitting laterally in the cover? Wouldn't you want to know about that? And they go, oh, but it's like, $40 a sample or whatever. And you still hit those roadblocks occasionally, but it's becoming less of an issue, I think, because sometimes it takes years to the point of drilling a hole once you've got through all the regulatory requirements, right, in certain parts of the world. So, assaying is easy. And then I think we're moving to a point too where people can see that the logging that geologists are doing without any chemistry data or spectral data to support them, or even some sort of categorized RGB imagery, right? It's terrible, right? It's not very consistent, and we're getting, some companies are well ahead of this. So, Newcrest, probably one of them in core scan space. They were well ahead of everyone else in terms of integrating that into their logging workflows. I don't know how they're going now, but at least for a long time, they look like they were able to hand a geologist some information to log with, right? And that's all where we've got to get towards, is that you want to be logging intelligently, and this is where June Hill's paper I like it, because what scale are you actually logging? What is the scale of the problem that you're trying to address? And I was one of those people. I think I hold the record for the longest drill log in Rosebery Mine, because I was a trees person, right? I was logging every little texture in the core, and I was just going, oh, you can't miss this. And of course it was all rubbish, right? I just didn't know. And I had one of the older geos come to me and goes, congratulations on spending all that time that no one will ever look at. And you've got the record for the longest log, but that's a waste of time. We can be so much smarter about what we do if you know what scale you're meant to be operating at. And that depends on which part of the exploration and mining chain you're sitting within, of course. Is it 1 metre scale? What's boundaries are important to you? If you're doing sequence stratigraphy, how wide do your divisions need to be? If you're looking at mining something and your benches are certain width, do you look at things within that width, or is the width of those benches enough? There's so many different ways to approach it, but that's all the easy stuff if you've got the information in your hands, and we increasingly do so. So now we've wandered off the topic a little bit there, but I don't know, does that prompt any...
I was warned that we would wander, but I think the wandering's great.
Yeah, so I don't know, where does that prompt any ideas or questions from you?
I think that in the sense that you're talking about June Hill's paper, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, but when you're talking about things like that, you're talking about taking all this all this data that we have, applying it in ways that are more along the lines of machine learning. I guess that kind of leads me into my second question is really, do you think that now where we are, or a little bit in the future, do you think that is this the death of classical geochemistry, this kind of stuff that Scott Haley does, or do you think that there's an integration of the two? Kind of, I guess, just at a high level, like what do you think? What are you seeing? Is really the question.
Yeah, that is a great question, and there are times when you can sort of get stressed about the fact that the game is shifting under your feet. Like, it's I've spent a lot of time looking at bivariate plots, particularly for mobile elements. Scott Haley approach. That's why I think we mentioned his website as one of the reads for this podcast, because he's distilled it down to a fine art. He's also seen everybody's data in the world, right? So, I'd love to have his hard drive. Now, he's got that down to a fine art, but there's still a little bit of subjectivity around the way that he selects some of his groups, and we can't all have Scott Haley working for us, right? So, how do you make sure that you get the best set of eyes on the critical pieces of data, if that makes sense? And so I think what we'll see is that if you take a black box machine learning, whether supervised or unsupervised approaches, you end up a lot of the time with a bunch of rubbish, right? Because there's lots of sources of variation in your data, lots of sources of change in your elements or the ratios of elements. So you need to be able to provide a summary of your data that you can apply your classical approaches to. So even though we might play around with UMAP for certain variables, we'll plot it back in a 3D UMAP and spin it around, and we can see groups that pop out of that. But there's so many ways that UMAP can drop out in terms of, if you change how local or global the structure is that you're looking at within that kind of projection, that in the end, I always go to the scatter plots, the Scott Haley approach, if I can call it that, linked in gas with something that's got bazillions of points in it, with a very large data cloud. I start trying to understand what those data points mean back in something that I can understand in terms of the fundamental variables that feed into it. So the short answer to your question would be yes. I think we're going to blend the two, but you really can't, I guess, distill that high dimensionality type of data and understand it well if you don't have the basics pinned down, if you haven't looked at your probability plots of your individual variables before you feed them in. And those who've gone through multivariate stats training in the last 20 years will be sick to death of being told to make sure all of the variables obey certain principles and have certain distribution types before they get fed into certain algorithms. And there's a good reason for that. And I think we still need to ground any of the, I guess, the data science, inverted commas, approaches with some basic checks and filters in our classical, IO-gas space, or I can call it that, whether it's a scatter plot or a trial plot or some sort of custom diagram that you've made in there.